Everyone. Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain. For those of you who are watching this on video, you will notice that I changed my background, and my background looks like wet grass. Had to be, because what we are talking about today is הכשר לטומאה, or probably modern Hebrew you would say הכשרה לטומאה. Right? Basically, the requirement for liquids to come into contact with food in order for the food to be able to be susceptible to tumah, susceptible to ritual impurity. The reason why I have grass in back of me is because when you look at Vayikra, Parakid Aleph, Vayikra chapter 11, you find that the example that is offered for this kind of liquid making things susceptible to impurity is the following. We're talking about the Shmona Shratzim. We're talking about the 8 swarming creatures that are not kosher, that are made famous. I'll give you one example: lizard, or crocodile, a gecko, a chameleon. All those cuties. They're all tmeim. They are all impure foods, meaning they are all not kosher. And if one of their carcasses says Vayikra Parakid Aleph Pasuk Lamed Zayin V'chi Yipol Minivlatam, and if one of their carcasses falls Al Kol Zera Zerua, on any seed Asher Yizarea that is to be sown, Tahoru, it is still pure, even though a carcass, which is a source of impurity, a non-kosher carcass, which is a source of impurity, has fallen on it, it is still pure. However, v'chiyutan mayim al zera, if water has been put on the seed, v'nafal minivlatam alav, and any part of the carcass of one of those 8 swarmers falls on it, then tamehu lachem, it becomes impure. So that is where we get the concept, that is where we get the notion that in order for foods in general, including meat, not just vegetables, but in order for food in general to be susceptible to ritual impurity, 9 times out of 10, it has to come into contact with some liquid. Now, I say 9 times out of 10, but that's not really true, because we also have the opinion that shechita itself, that slaughtering an animal itself, makes the food that comes from that animal susceptible to tumah. We also have another example in the Gemara in Chullin elsewhere that talks about the possibility of chibat kodesh, love of the consecrated items, making the food of kachim able to be susceptible to tumah, even without coming into contact with a liquid that should be doing that work instead. So I say 9 times out of 10, but it's not. What I want to do in this brief shiur is I want to do 2 things. One, I want to understand the logic of this, like why liquids, what exactly is that doing? 2, I actually want to look at a place in the Jewish calendar where we somewhat take this to heart, and I'll explain why I mean somewhat later, but that's urchatz at the seder, when we wash our hands before karpas. That is related somehow to this. It's not exact, but welcome to the world of tumah and tara, where there are so many layers. But there is a dotted line there. So let's jump into the sources to first try to understand what is the logic behind needing some liquid. And of course, according to Chazal, according to the rabbis, there are actually 7 different liquids that can make food susceptible to tumah, contact with which can make food susceptible to tumah. And I want to notice, I'm not saying it makes the food tameh. I'm saying it makes it able to conduct tumah, like like conducting electricity, right? Like it can't conduct tumah, even if a carcass falls on it. It can't conduct tumah. It can't accept tumah unless it has gotten wet with one of these 7 liquids, and those include even honey, and it includes even blood, and it includes oil. So it's very interesting. It doesn't just include water. So there's a lot that's been expanded out since Vayikra Yud Aleph. But I want to look at 2 basic perspectives on this question of what the liquid aspect is here. And the 2 basic perspectives, one is focusing on the physical properties of liquid. That's one. And the other is focusing on the process of food becoming food. So let's start with the physical properties of liquid. We start with Rabbeinu Bachye, 13th, 14th century Spain. He says, "V'chi yutan mayim al zera," if water was put on the seed, and again, water is to become a stand-in for any of those 7 liquids. Seed is to become a stand-in for any food stuff. And by the way, yutan, if it's put on, is going to become you have to make sure, v'chi yutan is spelled without the vav, so it's spelled like ki yitain. You have to make sure that the person involved with this food or seed or whatever it is actually wants there to be water falling on it. It has to be similar to v'chi yitain, right? They actually put it on there. Oh, and one more thing, none of this applies if it's still attached to the ground, right? Can't become susceptible to tumah if it's still attached to the ground. But all that aside, Rabbeinu Bachye says, Mikan darshu razal. From here, Rabbeinu Zichronam Lebracha, that our rabbis of blessed memory, expounded, Shehamayim machshirim lekabel tumah. That water, and I'm going to add those other 6 other liquids, end up preparing food to be able to conduct tumah, meaning they make food susceptible to the possibility of tumah. V'kivan shenafal ala perot mayim, and once water, and I'm going to add, or 6 other liquids, fall onto that food, le'olam harei muchsharim lekabel tumah. They are always susceptible to potentially contracting impurity. Afal pi shaperot yiveshin, even though right now they may already be dried. V'tam hadavar, and here's the reason he says, shahalechut, moisture, hu madbik lichluch hatumah. Moisture is something that makes things stick to it, right? It absorbs things. So the sense is why liquids as a הכשרה לטומאה, as a הכשר לטומאה, as a preparation to make something susceptible to tumah, because whatever tumah gets near it, it will absorb it. It'll get attached to it. So he says, parenthetically, I know that raises problems because what happens when the perot are already dry? And I said that even dry perot, if they've been wet at some point, could end up being susceptible to tumah. So he says, "V'im anu gozrim tumah al halachim v'lo al yeveshim," and the problem is, if we were to decree the susceptibility to tumah only on food that's still wet, v'lo al yeveshim, but not that's already dried off, natata dvarecha l'shiurin, you would fall into a different problem, which is you would basically be making different standards for the same product, right? Meaning we don't want to make different standards for the same product. We don't want to say, well, if it was wet but it's not wet anymore, or if it's this amount wet and not that amount wet. Now, that in itself is an interesting question. Are there, what is included in that concern generally, given how hair-splitting in a fascinating way the Talmud can be, the idea that you can't have different standards, in some senses that rings true, and in other senses it really does not. So, but here he's saying, it's true, really the only reason why we would have a problem with the fruit is if it's still wet, but so that shelo natat tvarech l'shirin kidei shelo latet tvarech l'shirin, so that we are not establishing multiple standards. Ein ra'oi shenigzor tumah l'chatzein. It's not appropriate that we say, tumah only applies halfway to these foods. Lefichach, therefore, gazrat Torah tumah al haperot. Therefore, the Torah decreed ritual impurity, or really susceptibility to ritual impurity, on this produce, even if they're already dry. Now. Because at some point they were wet. So Rabbeinu B'chaye, and there's like a whole school of thought around this, the focus here is on the fact that the liquids, or the water in the Torah itself, that water is midabek things to it, that it absorbs things, it makes things stick to it. And thus the notion of the tumah being able to be absorbed by it, as opposed to, think Teflon, right? Like the tumah would fall right off if it had never gotten, if it's not connected with water. Yes, we do have a technical problem, which is it might be dry now, but Rabbeinu B'chaye has an explanation for that too. There's a different approach to the idea of הכשר לטומאה, and that approach focuses more on the process of food becoming food. So, for example, in the Gemara in Chullin on Kuf Yud Chet Amud Aleph 118a, Amar Rav Huna B'Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna son of Rav Yoshua says, Peirot shelo huchsheru, Peirot, produce that has not been prepared for susceptibility to tumah, meaning they have not come in contact with a liquid, kitanur shelo nigmara melachto dami, is like an oven that hasn't been completed. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is, in order for a kli, in order for a vessel to become a vessel for the purposes of tumah and tahara, for the purposes of, or really for the purposes of tumah, for the purposes of becoming ritually impure, it must be able to be used for its purpose, right? Meaning it must be complete. And a tanur, an oven that is not completed yet, is not yet a vessel for purposes of contracting tumah. Likewise, and by the way, people connect this back, Chazal in some places connect this back to Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, where they're giving out the spoils of Midyan. And of course, in the spoils of Midyan, there's a whole description of what happens in order to purify the vessels. What can go in water can go in water, other things go in fire, etc. Right? And the way that those vessels are described later in the parak, Vayikach Moshe ve'Elazar Kohen et hazahav me'itam. Moshe and Elazar, the priest, took the gold from the Jewish soldiers who had taken it from the Midianites. Kol kli ma'aseh, all vessels of labor. So we learn from that it has to be useful for, and here I'm going to say for a purpose, in order for it to be able to contract ritual impurity. So this is how Rav Soloveitchik is cited in the Chumash that's based on his teachings, Chumash Mesoret Harav. Water renders the seeds susceptible to impurity. Conceptually, contact with water is not a prerequisite for allowing food to be mikabel tumah. It is actually a prerequisite for attaining the identity of food, which is in turn capable of being mikabel tumah, right? Meaning, think about it as really what's being done here is it's being turned into food. Now, you might say, we can give all sorts of reasons for that. Maybe it's turned into food now because we've washed it off in order to eat it, right? Meaning, what is it that conceptually makes the contact with liquid turning it into food? So that is a question behind. And then you have the question of, okay, why does that also apply to blood? Why does that also apply to honey? Why does that also, right? Certainly blood is one that stands out as like, whoa, why does blood do the trick also, right? Could just be because it's a liquid and it has property, right? Nothing's perfect here. These foods are, halakhically speaking, not food at all prior to being washed, and are therefore not susceptible to tumah until they come into contact with water. This is evidenced by the halakha of chibat hakodesh, which states that items used in the temple service do not require water in order to be mekabel tumah, because in the words of the Gemara, the high regard for consecrated items itself, chibat hakodesh, right, renders these items as food. Chibat hakodesh renders the item as food, and therefore contact with water is not needed to achieve this purpose. Similarly, in explaining the view that slaughtering an animal renders it susceptible to being mekabel tumah, right? We mentioned these as asterisks from the beginning when I said, well, 9 times out of 10 it has to come into contact with liquid. Well, in explaining the view that slaughtering an animal renders it susceptible to being mekabel tumah, even without coming into contact with liquid, Rashi writes that since the slaughter renders the animal permissible to eat, it also renders it food with regard to being mekabel tumah. Here again, we see that the requirement of contact with liquid is in order to give an item the status of food. It's not an independent requirement. Now, by the way, I think this is very interesting in terms of what we learned this week in the Gemara in Chullin about the difference between, what requires machshava, what requires intent in order to make it clear that it is a food to begin with, and then requires hechsher, I guess, in order to also make it a food to begin with. So if you look in the Rambam, in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Tumat Ochlin, the law of impure foods, Gimel, chapter 3, Halakha 3, he says, Yesh Ochlin shetzrichin hechsher ve'enan tzrichin machshava. There's some food that, in order to be susceptible to tumah, requires only hechsher, right? Requires only this, generally speaking, physical act of coming into contact with liquid once it is no longer attached to the ground, and at least the positive experience of it, of the owners, right? But it doesn't require special intent to make it a food. It already is a food. Some require intent for it to be classified as food. It doesn't require this coming in contact with the liquid. There are those that require thought to say that it is a food, and also coming into contact with a liquid. And there are those that do not require either of those things in order to be susceptible to tumah. Now, you can go through this. I put this in the sources if you want to go through it, but I actually want to look at only one of these categories because I think it makes it very, very clear. Okay, you ready? Ve'elu tzrichin machshava ve'hechsher. The following is something that requires both thought that it should be food for people and contact with liquid in order to become susceptible to food impurity, meaning as a food to become susceptible to impurity. Basar haporesh min hachai. Okay? Meat that, gross, but meat that comes off of a living being, okay? And then I'm not even going to, ben min ha'adam, ben min ha'be'ima, ben min ha'of, etc., right? Meaning no matter where the meat comes from. But I want to use this as an example. Right? When you have meat that comes off of an animal that's alive, it's not necessarily by default considered food. Right? Like, It's not necessarily considered food. It would require machshava. It would require actual intention that like humans should eat it, and it would become, let's say sold in the Gentile shuk, right? Sold in a non-Jewish shuk. But it then also, in order to be susceptible to tumah, now that machshava has rendered it food, it also has to have הכשר לטומאה. It also has to come into contact with a liquid. Now, is that coming into contact with a liquid because of what Rabbeinu B'chaya says, that it is, that liquid absorbs tumah more, and therefore it makes it easier to absorb tumah, or like think about it like electricity, right? Meaning if there's no current, or if there's no, I'm trying to remember physics. It's not so easy. I'm trying to remember AP physics. Whew. That's been unused for a while. I'm going to go back to that. If there's no circuit, let's put it that way. If there's no circuit, and even if you have a current, it can't run. There's no circuit, right? So the water is like the circuit. There we go. Thank you, Rabbi Kovitz, Alav Shalom, my physics teacher. Right? Or is the hechsher actually like the gemar melacha? It's finishing off the food to physically show that it's food, the way you would finish off a tanur. Right? Just an interesting question to layer in. What I want to do in the last few minutes is I want to look at an example. Yes, it's true. If you look in number 7, you see that there were people even after the fall of the Beit HaMikdash who would try to eat their Chullin. They would eat their mundane meat in a state of ritual purity, which means that they have to pay close attention to all of these food impurity laws. But for us, we don't come into contact with them a lot. I would say washing for bread, which we gave a different shiur on a while back when we were on Chullin Lamed Gimel, right? Washing for bread is one of those places where we come into contact with the discussion about food impurity, and definitely go back and check out that shiur. But I want to give another example, which is urchatz, right? At the seder, we get up after we make kiddush, we go wash, no bracha, for the purpose of eating karpas, right? Very strange. So if you look at Psachim, Kuf Tet Vav Amad Aleph, Psachim 115, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, Kol shetibulo b'mashkeh, tzarich netilat yadayim. Any food item that is going to be immersed in a liquid, right, requires washing beforehand. Now, I want us to keep in mind, why? What's so special about a liquid, right? So, some people are thinking that liquid will be able to transfer the impurity to the food. Now, don't get me wrong. Parenthetically, the reason why I say this is related and unrelated to our topic. It's related to our topic because we're talking about liquid and its susceptibility to impurity. It's a little bit unrelated because presumably what we're talking about is produce that has come into contact with water a long time ago, you wouldn't have to wash for, right? And this is a whole machloket, it's a whole discussion if you want to look in the Gemara in Chullin on Daf 33, right? Daf Lamed Gimel. But now it's being dipped in something, and now is when you have to wash for it, right? So it's not exactly the same thing, but I think it's an interesting, when else are we going to explain what is going on with urchatz, okay? So Tosfot in Psachim say, I want to explain to you why you would wash for food that is dipped in water, which of course we only do at the seder. We don't do any other time. Right? It says, V'nir ed seems the netila dahacha, that this washing, lo mishum kedusha or nikiyut, it's not because of holiness or cleanliness, kimo benahama, like washing for bread. Again, go back to the shiur on washing for bread, and also look at the Gemara in Brachot, Daf Nun Gimel Amud Bet, right? 53b. Ella, rather, what is this washing for? Mishum shelo yitameh hamashkin liyot tchila. Chazal decreed that hands are shniot l'tumah, that hands are secondary tumah releasers. They did that in order to protect truma. Okay, so this way you'd have to wash before truma, and you're going to keep everything separate. Okay, and they also decreed that if you touched a liquid with those shniot hands, with those hands that had not been washed, that if you touched a liquid with them, that liquid becomes a rishon l'tumah. That liquid gets even more severe, and that has to do with other things. That has to do with men's seminal emissions and liquid. We're not going into that right now. Okay. V'hei asur lishtotan, and the worry is, it would then be usher for you to drink that water. We don't want you consuming that liquid that is now tameh because of your hands. V'lifsol et gufo, and that would invalidate your body. In other words, Tosfot would basically say, let me tell you why this is. Your hands are ritually impure by exera of the rabbis. When you touch the liquid, right, it's going to, when you dip the apple in the honey, so to speak, right, you're going to end up making or maybe when you're pouring the honey, maybe when, figure out a way that you're coming into contact, you're going to then ingest the liquid that is tameh, and it is usher for you to do that. And again, gzera derabanan. This whole thing is rabbinic decrees, right? Rabbinic decrees that your hands are tameh. Rabbinic decrees that the liquid would become tameh from your hands. Rabbinic decree that you shouldn't be, rabbinic decree that you shouldn't be drinking tameh things, right? And then he tries to prove it in all sorts of ways. Very, very interesting. And he says, and that's why there's no bracha on it, because all you're doing is try to prevent an isser. You're trying to prevent a prohibition from drinking something tameh. It's not that you're trying to do anything in the affirmative. The Rambam, on the other hand, brings this halakha, and again, we're referring only to urchatz on this because that's when we use this. But the Rambam, on the other hand, brings this halakha in context of washing for bread. Kol ha'ochel hapat shemivarchin alav hamotzi, anybody who eats bread whose bracha is hamotzi, meaning not like rice bread. Tzarich nitilat yadayim tchila v'sof. You have to wash before and after. V'afal pi shu pat chullin, even though it is mundane bread. V'afal pi she'en yadav meluch lachot, even though your hands are not dirty. Ve'en yodea lehen tumah, and you don't know that any tumah contacted your hands. Lo yochal ad she'yitol shtei yadav. No eating until you wash both your hands. Hain, and likewise, kol davar shetibulo b'mashkin, anything that is dipped, okay, anything that is dipped in liquid, sarich nitilat yadayim tchila, needs washing first. So the Rambam does not bring down what we today would call urchatz, because it's the only time we do it. He doesn't bring it as something that's totally separate from washing for bread. He brings it as something that is similar. In the same way that we said your hands are shniot, your hands are secondary tumah creators, and therefore, because we wouldn't want you to touch truma with it, we don't want you to touch regular hamotzi with it. So same way, some people might say, oh, well, there was also truma given on oil. So that's a liquid. So anything that comes into contact with a liquid, you also have to wash, because the same way you would have had to wash for truma oil, you would have, right? So it's a little bit different, and you could imagine that this might be behind a question of, oh, well, maybe you should have a bracha for it, right? Now, lema'aseh, practically we do this one time a year, right? We do it at Pesach, at the Seder, or twice a year, two Sederim, let's say, and we don't say bracha, right? So we're clearly thinking of it as something differently. But it's, it's tangentially related to the fact that liquid is involved in making things susceptible to tumah. It's a little bit different because it's about the liquid becoming tameh itself. But I couldn't resist. So great learning with you, as always.